So let's ask a man who probably knows a lot more about the matter. Former advisor to the SecDef under Trump, our pal, retired Colonel Doug McGregor, back on the program. Colonel, how about it? You think it's Russian propaganda, or do you think Zelensky's getting really desperate?
Well, I think this is an act of desperation by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have infiltrated teams into Russia before and launched unmanned aircraft or drones at various targets. The border is endless. It's 1,100 miles, forested. It's very easy to penetrate. And they got close enough to launch these things at the Kremlin. Now, did it make any difference? Absolutely not. Is it going to change anything? No. And that's why I say this is an act of desperation. The Ukrainians no longer have any air defenses. We've got to stop and consider that. You were in the Air Force. When ground forces have no air defense, it's a turkey shoot on the ground. And that's exactly what's happening right now as we're talking. Many, many strikes are going in all over Ukraine. A lot of them are being launched from aircraft. So Ukraine's in deep trouble, and there's no easy way out.
You said something like this has happened before. Have we heard of Ukrainian soldiers or spies actually in country carrying this out, and then they've been killed or apprehended, so there's some proof or evidence, not just Russia saying that?
Yes. In fact, they've captured some teams that weren't ever able to launch anything. But you'll recall just a few months ago, there were attacks on a couple of air bases, one of which was the Engels Air Force Base in southern Russia. And they did manage to strike an aircraft on one occasion and do some damage. So this is not the first time. What's interesting about this, of course, is that they penetrated deeply enough to reach the Kremlin and at least strike the building in which allegedly President Putin resides. But it's irrelevant. It's an act of desperation. There's not much the Ukrainians can do. Once the ground dries out, there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops with hundreds of thousands of guns and tanks and so forth that are going to move forward and sweep everything before them. And I think Zelensky knows that.
Where does that leave us? $118 billion price tag and counting. You have members of both sides of the aisle in the Senate and a couple in the House, obviously this White House, all saying we support Ukraine, we're defending Ukraine, we're going to keep sending money. But it sounds like from you and from others I've had on this program, it's a bottomless, empty pit because this war is going to go nowhere, even if we continue to throw billions of dollars at it.
In 1967, General William Westmoreland went all over the country announcing imminent victory for U.S. forces in Vietnam. He insisted that the North Vietnamese were defeated, the communists were on the run, and we had, quote unquote, turned the corner. And LBJ stood by him and echoed that sentiment. Then in January of 1968, we got the Tet Offensive. We know the rest of the story. It brought down LBJ's administration. So I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar happen to President Biden and his supporters on the Hill. They'll look ridiculous. And the bad news is Ukraine will have been destroyed. And hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions driven out of the country, and for what? Because of our vanity, because we thought we could use them to harm Russia. Russia is stronger now than ever. Its economy is booming. What a disaster.
Exactly. And all those, like you said, innocent civilians, if Biden just would have forced these two to the bargaining table instead of continuing this war. But it does have to do with Russia in connection to China. And I think you and I may have spoken about this the last time you appeared on the program, and that's China trying to work with Pakistan and other nations over there to connect a railway so they can start shipping more goods and services and become more independent because, as you've said on the program, they lack a lot of food and certain supplies. And they also want to get their goods and products out to make more money. This is a good, a bad thing. I mean, China keeps getting bigger and bigger, and all we pay attention to these days under the Biden regime is Russia, instead of the main adversary we should be, China.
Well, I think we need to pay attention to our own economic health, and that's where we've fallen down badly. We should be interested in competing economically with what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese walk into Africa or other countries. They come in with cash. They want to do business. They make it very clear they're not going to interfere in the internal affairs of these countries. They're just there to do business. And so the Chinese are welcome. We show up and we threaten everyone unless they adhere to whatever we say the standard is for political development. We're trying to tinker with everybody's business. That's a disaster. But in this particular case, This railroad has been under construction for a long time. And the Pakistanis were essentially given an ultimatum. You know, you've got to secure this railroad for us, in which case we'll run it all the way down to the Indian Ocean, which allows, as you pointed out, the Chinese to export through Pakistan, but at the same time also to bring in the natural resources that are available to the Pakistanis. But they were told, if you don't do this, then we'll go exclusively through Iran. And they've already discovered they can't go through Afghanistan for obvious reasons. It can't be secured. This is a problem they're going to confront all over the Eurasian continent. We have a huge advantage. If we'll build the fast sea lift and build the fast rail lines across the United States, we can outpace the Chinese. We can deliver goods and services faster. We can import faster, export faster than the Chinese can.
Fill me in on this uprising and this conflict in Sudan and how it came to be before we get to this exit. And if it's going to be successful, God help us, hopefully not deadly.
Well, the story in Sudan is a complex one. Dan, what you and your viewers need to understand is that sadly, Sudan has experienced more conflict than peace over the last several hundred years. This is another conflict that involves both ideological opposition, parties, but also tribal conflicts overlap with it. We have Russians who have some interest in Sudan, some European powers, ourselves, squabbling over resources, particularly in the south with regard to oil. The bottom line is that the place is falling apart. These people are killing each other, and they're starting to look for opportunities to kill us. So we've really got to get out. The question is, what took us so long to make the decision to get our American citizens out of the place? It wasn't as though we didn't see this coming. We've been through this in Sudan before. And the question is, how do we get in and get out without losing aircraft? Because now the Sudanese have access to a lot of technologies that they didn't have before.
Wow. Something that scared me about this whole thing, if we can bring the article, guys, up about the WHO, not that I trust the WHO, of course, after the COVID pandemic, but the WHO is warning now, and we just heard Joe Biden say it the other day, and a bunch of folks in his regime, we could be facing another global outbreak in the next year, so we better be prepared right in time for another election. But the WHO puts this out yesterday. They're very worried about a huge biological outbreak because we have national biolabs in the Sudan. And so if they're attacked by some of these rebels or whatever and exposed, we're talking about now releasing possible different viruses into the world again.
Well, I think in Sudan they're worried primarily about the measles and polio.
Okay.
Polio has been largely eradicated. Measles are still with us. But the bottom line is that they're right. And the question we ought to be asking is, just as we had these laboratories in Ukraine about which no one has said anything lately,
right,
which in many cases appear to have been even more dangerous, now we have these laboratories in Sudan. What are we doing in these various poor countries? Remember, Ukraine's the poorest country in Europe. Why are we setting up these laboratories in these places? What is our goal? It's a very disturbing picture that's beginning to emerge. And by the way, this doesn't help us globally at all.
Wow. You mentioned Ukraine and the labs that were there. Let's go over to that one quick. Get your take on these latest reports from those leaked documents. Some interesting stuff that we're learning. So there's going to be a new offensive launched by Ukraine. They're going to try and take back territory. You know this war in and out. What's going on? Is that legit?
Well, what we know now are things along the following lines. We know that the Russians can intercept all of these high mobility rocket attacks and destroy the rockets in midair. We know that the Russians are destroying the artillery equipment and systems that we send over faster than we can get them set up. We know that the Russians have literally annihilated most of the air defense network, which was supposed to protect the Ukrainian forces from being destroyed by drones, rockets, missiles, and aircraft. The Russian Air Force is now operating increasingly with great freedom because Ukrainians have no means of stopping them. The bottom line is Ukrainian soldiers have died in great numbers. We estimate that they've now lost over 300,000 killed.
Wow.
Within the last couple of weeks, there's evidence they've lost 4,000 men trying to potentially test or even break through existing Russian defenses. The situation is that it's too muddy to do much, We expect more rain in Ukraine over the next couple of weeks, so it's still a huge sea of mud. I think the Russians are sitting back comfortably behind their defenses. Any attempt by the Ukrainians to break through will be destroyed. And that's the real story that is now leaked out of the White House. People in the National Security Council staff know this is a dead end. Ukraine is losing. And the question is, what do we say? What do we do? All they've done is lie to us for over a year now about the great Ukrainian victory that's inevitable. They know that's not going to happen. They know we have no means of stopping the Russians once the Russians renew the offensive, which I think they will in June, once everything dries out and the Ukrainians have exhausted themselves.
Let's get after it on these documents. There's a huge investigation now. They want heads to roll. I thought if you found out our government's lying, we have whistleblower programs to protect people so that the American people can know their government's lying to them, and the whistleblower shouldn't be in trouble for that. But yet now they want heads to roll on this one.
Well, how many R's do you have in the words fat chance? I wouldn't want to put my life at risk, quite frankly, by leaking these kinds of documents, but someone, somewhere in the defense apparatus, obviously decided that he or she had had enough. And it appears that these documents were actually downloaded, then subsequently photographed, and then eventually uploaded separately. This makes it much harder, obviously,